Some things aren't meant to stay behind when you move away. Maya learned this the hard way when she discovered that distance means nothing to something that was never truly alive. It's the nightmares, the sleep paralysis, shadow figure that had tormented her for 15 years, all of it would stay buried in that cramped bedroom in Ohio. She was 25 now, successful, rational. The paralysis episodes had stopped completely once she left for college, and she'd convinced herself they were just stress-induced hallucinations brought on by her parents' messy divorce. Maya had always told herself that moving 2,000 miles away from her childhood home would fix everything. For 3 blissful months, Maya slept peacefully in her king-sized bed, waking, refreshed, and optimistic about her fresh start. Her new apartment in Portland was everything her old room wasn't. Spacious, bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in streams of natural light. Then came the first night it returned, and there had been something different about this episode. In her childhood home, the figure had always remained perfectly still, a static presence that vanished the moment she could move again. This time, she could have sworn she'd seen it shift slightly, as if adjusting its position to get a better view. The familiar, suffocating weight pressed down on her chest, and her eyes darted frantically around the room she'd grown to love. She bought blackout curtains to eliminate any play of light that might create illusions. She researched sleep paralysis online, reading clinical explanations about REM sleep intrusion and hypnagogic hallucinations. But with each episode, Maya noticed disturbing changes. The figure seemed more solid somehow, less like a trick of light. The sound came again, a subtle shuffling from somewhere in her bedroom. With agonizing slowness, she turned her head toward the familiar corner. Not just the shadow acknowledging her, but the horrible certainty that it knew her, had always known her, and had been waiting patiently for this moment. In shadow, and more like something occupying actual space in her room. And it was moving, not during the paralysis, but between episodes. Without the paralysis to lock her in place, Maya could see it clearly as it shifted its weight from one impossibly long leg to the other. It wasn't frozen in her peripheral vision, or locked in the moment between sleep and waking. It was there, present and active in her waking world. She began marking its position mentally, and each time it appeared, it had shifted slightly closer to her bed, then another. Each movement brought it closer to her bed, and Maya realized with dawning horror that it no longer needed her to be paralyzed to make its approach. The police report noted no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, just an unmade bed and a strange, persistent chill that seemed to cling to the corners of every room. The shadow had brought its own silence with it, a suffocating quiet that swallowed her voice before it could form. On her first night, she woke to the familiar weight of sleep paralysis pressing down on her chest, and caught sight of something tall and thin, standing perfectly still in the corner of her bedroom. It had grown stronger, more solid, feeding off 15 years of her fear and recognition. She even started a sleep journal, documenting her bedtime routine and stress levels. But a new kind of paralysis held her, not the medical condition she'd grown up with, but pure, primal terror. And in that moment, she understood the truth that had been stalking her since childhood. Some things don't haunt houses. She understood now that this wasn't sleep paralysis at all. Never had been. The shadow had simply been visiting her during those vulnerable moments when the barrier between worlds grew thin, when her sleeping mind could perceive what her waking consciousness refused to accept. By the 6th, it stood near her bedroom door. The progression was deliberate, calculated, as if it were testing boundaries or gathering courage. The shadow had no discernible features, yet Maya could feel its attention focused entirely on her, boring into her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Just like in her childhood, she couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only lie there as terror coursed through her veins. She woke naturally around 2 a.m., not from paralysis, but from a strange cold that had settled over her apartment. As she lay there, fully mobile and alert, she heard something that made her blood freeze. The soft whisper of fabric against fabric. It's like clothing brushing against a wall. There, in the corner where her reading chair usually caught the morning light, stood the unmistakable silhouette. Maya jolted awake at 3:17 a.m., her body completely frozen. The shadow seemed to absorb light rather than be diminished by it, appearing as a void in the illuminated space. She tried sleeping in different rooms: the couch, the guest bedroom, even a sleeping bag on the kitchen floor. The shadow found her everywhere, always positioned closer than the night before. It was exactly as she remembered: tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its frame. The corner was empty, just her chair and the small bookshelf beside it, both clearly visible in the glow from the street lamp outside. The episode lasted maybe 30 seconds before her body suddenly released, and she gasped, shooting upright in bed. Stress from the new job, she whispered to herself, though her voice shook. Just stress. But deep down, Maya knew better. The shadow looked exactly the same as it had in Ohio, unchanged by time or distance. For a week, Maya tried to rationalize what had happened. None of it helped. The shadow returned 3 more times that week, always at the same corner, always during those terrifying moments when her body refused to obey her commands. By the 4th episode, it had moved from the corner to beside her dresser. Maya started sleeping with her lights on, but it made no difference. 2 weeks after its return, Maya experienced something that shattered her last grip on rational explanation. Maya held her breath, straining to listen. The shadow was there, but it was moving. The figure seemed to sense her awareness. Its featureless head turned toward her with deliberate precision, and Maya felt something she'd never experienced during her childhood episodes: recognition. Maya wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but lie there staring at the impossible thing in her bedroom. The shuffling sound came again, and the shadow took a step forward. As it reached the foot of her bed, Maya finally found her voice, but when she opened her mouth to scream, no sound emerged. The last thing Maya saw before everything went dark was the shadow extending one impossibly thin arm toward her, its elongated fingers reaching across the covers. They haunt people. The next morning, Maya's landlord found her apartment empty, her belongings still in place, but no sign of the tenant herself. 3 days later, a new tenant moved into Maya's old apartment in Ohio, but this time it wasn't alone. Sometimes the most terrifying warnings come written in crayon by a child's trembling hand. Liam thought he'd gotten a deal of a lifetime when he bought the Victorian house on Maple Street for $30,000 below market value. The realtor had been evasive about why the previous family had moved out so suddenly, muttering something about personal circumstances and needing a fresh start. But Liam didn't care about gossip. He cared about square footage and the original hardwood. Floors that gleamed even in the dim afternoon light, filtering through the heavy curtains. The edges were worn, as if it had been handled frequently. At the top, written in neat block letters, were the words, "House rules, please read carefully." It wasn't until his 3rd day in the house that he found the list. He'd been unpacking boxes in the kitchen when he noticed something taped to the inside of the pantry door. A piece of yellow legal paper, laminated and secured with clear packing tape. "It will only get louder." Below that, in the same careful handwriting, was a numbered list. 1 dot, never acknowledge the crying after 2 a.m. 2. If you hear scratching from the basement, do not open the door. Wait until morning. 3. The 3rd step from the top creaks at exactly 11:47 p.m. Don't make our mistake. The Hendersons. It was clearly some kind of elaborate prank left by the previous owners. It's probably their way of getting back at whoever bought their house so cheap. Liam settled into his routine, working from his home office during the day and exploring the house's many rooms in the evenings. The Victorian was larger than he'd initially realized, with a maze of corridors and closets that seemed to serve no particular purpose. He found it charming, if a bit drafty, crumpled up the paper and tossed it in the trash, shaking his head at the absurdity of it all. Liam got out of bed, slipped on his shoes, and made his way downstairs. The crying grew louder as he descended, more desperate. It was definitely coming from inside the house. "Don't drink it." Soft, muffled sobs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. His first thought was that it might be a neighbor. The houses on Maple Street were close together, and sound could travel in unexpected ways. But as he listened more carefully, the crying seemed to be coming from directly beneath his bedroom floor. The hallway light he'd been leaving on had burned out 3 times, despite being a brand new LED bulb. On the 15th, exactly as the list predicted, rust-colored water had flowed from the kitchen tap for nearly an hour before running clear again. And twice now, he'd caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision when passing the master bedroom. Something pale and small in the corner where the ceiling met the walls. Step over it. 4. Keep the hallway light on between midnight and 3 a.m. A rhythmic scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across wood, emanating from behind the basement door. Outside, he could hear children playing in the street, their laughter carrying through the windows. Normal sounds of a normal neighborhood. But inside his house, the shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker. And there, in the corner where the walls met, something small and pale was waiting for him to look up. And somewhere in the walls, he could swear he heard the faint sound of crying, even though it was still daylight. And Liam realized with growing horror that some rules aren't meant to be broken, they're meant to keep things in. And there, at the bottom of the door, was a small hole, as if something had been trying to dig its way through. Liam lay rigid in his bed, listening as the sound grew more frantic, more desperate. It went on for hours, occasionally stopping only to resume with renewed intensity. Liam stood in his living room, heart pounding, straining to hear any other noise. He sat in his living room with the list spread out before him, reading and rereading each rule, trying to remember which ones he'd already broken. The crying, the basement door, the hallway light. How many violations was that? The basement door, which he was certain he'd locked before bed, stood slightly ajar. The laminated paper looked older somehow, more yellowed around the edges. And there, beneath the original 7 rules, was a new line written in that same frantic handwriting. After several minutes, he convinced himself it had been his imagination, or perhaps pipes settling in the old house. He went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily, always. 5. If you see a child in the upstairs window, close the curtains immediately and leave the room. In the daylight, it looked even more ridiculous, but those wet footprints had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. 6. The kitchen faucet will run red water on the 15th of each month. 7. Never, under any circumstances, look directly at the corner of the master bedroom ceiling between 3:15 and 3:17 a.m. At the bottom, written in a different hand, smaller, shakier, almost frantic, it's a final note. We tried to ignore them too. Liam stared at the list for a long moment, then laughed. The first week passed without incident. It was on a Tuesday night, just past 2 a.m., when he first heard the crying. Liam had been lying in bed, scrolling through his phone, when the sound drifted up from somewhere below. He remembered the list then, the first rule echoing in his mind. Never acknowledge the crying after 2 a.m. But that was ridiculous. If someone was in distress, he couldn't just ignore them. "Hello?" he called out softly. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped immediately. Silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. The next morning, he found wet footprints on the kitchen floor. Small, child-sized prints that led from the basement door to the sink and back again. That evening, Liam retrieved a crumpled list from the trash and smoothed it out on his kitchen table. Over the next few days, he began to notice other things. But it was the scratching that finally broke his resolve. It started on a Friday night, just as he was drifting off to sleep. By morning, the scratching had stopped, but Liam found deep gouges in the basement door lock, parallel lines that looked disturbingly like claw marks. The list was back on his kitchen table when he went downstairs for coffee, though he didn't remember putting it there. 8. If you've already broken the rules, it's too late to leave, but you can still try to appease them. Liam's hand shook as he read the addition. That night, Liam made sure every light in the house was on as the clock struck 3:15 a.m. His eyes drifted involuntarily toward the ceiling of the master bedroom, visible through the open doorway. The list rustled in the sudden draft that filled the house. Sometimes the camera sees what we're not meant to see, and sometimes what it captures is already watching us back. Chloe had always believed that buying their first home would be the happiest day of her life. Standing on the front lawn of the charming Victorian house with Ben, keys gleaming in her palm, she felt nothing but pure joy. The realtor had just driven away, leaving them alone with their dream. A 3-bedroom house with original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch. Make sure you get the whole house in the shot. I want to remember everything about today. Chloe posed by the front door, arms spread wide in celebration. Ben captured her spinning on the porch, her sundress flowing around her. They took selfies with the house looming behind them, both grinning so hard their cheeks hurt. The autumn sun cast everything in a warm, honeyed glow, making even the weathered shutters look welcoming. In those beautiful, tall windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. We should document this, Ben said, pulling out his phone. First day as homeowners. Chloe laughed, smoothing down her hair. The silent stretch between them, punctuated only by the sound of his thumb swiping across the screen. Finally, he looked up, his face pale. Chloe had been taking pictures with her camera too, and she was dreading checking those images. This has to be some kind of camera glitch. It's digital artifacts or something. How had someone gotten inside their house? And why did it only show up in photographs? They spent the next hour taking photos from every angle. It wasn't until they were back at their apartment that evening, scrolling through the photos over takeout Chinese food, that Chloe first noticed it. The face appeared in every photograph, sometimes more defined than others, but consistently present in that same second-floor window. There was a brief pause. You know, dear, I should probably mention the previous owners did report some unusual experiences. Nothing serious, of course, just some odd sounds, cold spots. Old houses have their quirks. They did mention the room was always particularly cold, but I'm sure it's just drafts. The room was empty except for built-in bookshelves and that large window facing the front yard. These Victorian houses weren't built with modern insulation in mind. It was ice cold, much colder than the air in the room. In some shots, it seemed to be looking directly at the camera, at them. Ben, look at this one, she said, zooming in on her phone screen. In the photo where she was standing by the mailbox, their house stretched majestically behind her. I need to know. But there, in the second-floor window, the one in what would be their future office, was something that made her stomach clench. When he looked at the screen, his face went white. Something standing directly behind her, close enough that she should have felt its breath on her neck. They needed to do a final walkthrough before the movers came anyway. The afternoon light that had seemed so welcoming yesterday now cast long, ominous shadows across the rooms. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The house had been built in 1887 by a photographer named Edmund Blackwood, according to old newspaper archives. Blackwood had been obsessed with capturing images of the dead, a Victorian practice called post-mortem photography. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but witnesses reported that his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Only this time, it was inside the room with them, positioned exactly where Chloe had sensed the presence. All she could think about was that face in the photographs, that presence behind her in the empty room. Edmund Blackwood hadn't just believed that cameras could capture souls. He had become proof of it, strapped between the glass and the light, existing only in that split second when the shutter clicked and the image formed. Every footstep on the hardwood floors seemed to echo longer than it should. But even as she spoke about inspection contingencies and contract loopholes, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. Hey, in the dream, when she looked at her reflection in the glass, it wasn't her face staring back. Hey, Ben leaned over, squinting at the screen. That's weird. Must be a reflection or something. The article suggested he believed that cameras could capture souls, trap them in the glass and silver of the photographic process. His studio had been in the second-floor room that was now their intended office. A face, pale, indistinct, but unmistakably human, pressed against the glass from inside. What the hell? But Chloe was already swiping to the next photo, then the next. Her hands began to tremble. The face was there in every single image where the house was visible. Sometimes clearer, sometimes just a ghostly smear against the window, but always there, always watching. Ben, we were the only ones there. We had the only keys. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Let me see. Ben took the phone, his brow furrowed as he examined each photo. In every photo, it's from 2 different phones. When she finally did upload them to her laptop, her worst fears were confirmed. That night, Chloe couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that pale, distorted face pressed against the glass. Who was it? The next morning, she called the realtor. Oh, the Hendricks place, Mrs. Patterson said when Chloe described the house. What about the second-floor office window? Another pause, longer this time. Chloe hung up, feeling worse than before. She tried to convince herself it was just an overactive imagination, but that afternoon, she and Ben drove back to the house. The house felt different this time, so when they reached the second-floor office, Chloe immediately felt it. A bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with the October weather. It's freezing in here, Ben murmured, his breath visible in small puffs. Chloe approached the window slowly. The glass was spotless, offering a clear view of their car parked on the street below. She pressed her hand against the pane. Take a picture, she whispered. What? Take a picture of me standing here. Ben reluctantly pulled out his phone, the camera making its familiar shutter sound. Chloe, step away from the window. Now, but she had already seen it reflected in the glass. Not her own reflection, but something else. She spun around. The room was empty. Show me the photo, she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. In the image, Chloe stood alone by the window, but there, in the glass behind her, was the same pale face they'd seen in all the other pictures. They left the house immediately, not bothering to finish the walkthrough. That evening, Chloe found herself researching the property's history, but Blackwood had taken it further. Edmund Blackwood had died in that very room in 1923, found at his workbench, surrounded by hundreds of photographs. The house had changed hands many times since then. Most owners didn't stay long. Chloe closed her laptop, hands shaking. Outside, the October wind howled against their apartment windows, but she barely heard it. She realized now why the face only appeared in pictures. The next morning, Chloe called their lawyer about backing out of the purchase, because late that night, when she finally drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of standing in front of that second-floor window. It was Edmund Blackwood's, and he was smiling. And with that final story, we pull back from the abyss. For now, tales of ordinary lives brushing against the extraordinary, the terrifying, the unexplainable, from the shadow that mimics to the voice that calls from an empty house. We've seen tonight how thin the veil between our reality and a much darker one can be. These stories are not just fiction. They are born from real experiences, whispered in hushed tones, and shared to remind us that we are not always alone. And that's the most chilling thought, isn't it? Perhaps one of tonight's stories reminded you of something that happened to you, or to someone you know. A strange occurrence you've tried to forget. A noise in the night you rationalized away. A figure you saw for just a second. The details of your own brush with the darkness are what give this channel life. I invite you to leave your own story in the comments below. Let us know what you've seen in the shadows. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, show your support by hitting that like button. It helps these tales reach others who need a reminder to check their locks at night. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell. We have so many more stories to share, and you won't want to be left in the dark. Until next time, remember that you are not afraid of being alone. You are afraid of the bone-deep certainty that you are not.